I'm not sure what the incentives were that were associated with checking the box as a Native American in the census, as opposed to checking the box as a Native American on a college application form. But I will say this, it's very unusual for folks to do the leap from the white category to the black category, okay? Now, that has occurred, but not so much in the United States. It occurred recently in Brazil in the aftermath of the introduction of affirmative action policies on behalf of Afro-Brazilians. And Kirsten Mullen and I are doing a book on reparations for Black Americans. And so we have had to think carefully about what eligibility requirements you might have for access to reparations to preclude people suddenly deciding that they are Black to gain access to reparations. So, economists, we think about incentives. And so there you have it. Okay. So I also want to ask people to please stay and mingle afterwards because we're going to have a reception and a book signing. So first I'd like to introduce Jason Carter, who has a passionate and sustained commitment to human rights on a global scale. He's currently the chair of the Carter Center Board of Trustees, and he is a partner at Bondurant, Mixson, and Elmor in Atlanta. In 2010 to 2015, he served as a Georgia state senator, and he was the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia in 2014. Unfortunately, he is not currently the Democratic governor of Georgia, but I hope that he will run for office again. This is a moment when we need to encourage him to run for office again. So Jason Carter is especially passionate about maintaining and expanding voter rights and voter participation, and I think the conversation you will hear this afternoon will involve the intersection of immigration policy and voting rights. He was a Duke undergraduate, so we are thrilled to welcome him back to Durham and to Duke. And so my personal connection to Jason is the fact that I'm at Duke, I'm a Duke faculty member, but I also have a connection to Noel King, and I'm not sure if we've actually made this connection before, but we're both Brown University alums.
I had no idea.
Yeah, so, yeah. So Noel is one of America's most prominent journalists. She's going to conduct, I prefer to call it a conversation with Jason rather than calling it an interview. She is the co-host of NPR's Morning Edition, so you've probably heard her voice. And she is a correspondent for Planet Money. She helped launch the program, The Takeaway, and I think I've actually been on the program a couple of times. I've known Noel since she was a senior reporter and fill-in host for Marketplace. And so I have one anecdote I'd like to share. Occasionally, we have had some offline conversations when she's doing research for a story. And the last time she contacted me, she posed a question that I wasn't able to provide a good answer to. She was interested in the notion that has been generated from the Black Lives Matter movement, that there is a devaluation of Black lives in the United States, and she wanted to know what a numerical estimate might be of the extent of that devaluation. So at the time, I think I suggested some rough ideas about how you might construct such an estimate, but I didn't have one. In our forthcoming book, though, Kirsten and I actually generate numerical estimates of the devaluation of Black lives. I can't divulge any more until the book is in print, but maybe we'll be able to give you a scoop sometime next summer. So,
on air, I hope.
So I'm thrilled to welcome Jason Carter and Noel King to the stage to conclude our conference today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you guys all for sticking around for the last part of the day. This has been a fascinating set of conversations, and I'm glad to see so many of you still here. I think what Jason and I want to do is as Sandy said, have a conversation. And I know that we have many people in this room who are academics. I am not. I'm a journalist. Jason is a lawyer. And so I think if we hit a moment in the conversation where somebody really has something urgent to say because you've got expertise or you want to correct us on something, feel free to just throw your hand up. We'll talk until about 3:15 and then we'll open it up to questions. But if you have a question or a concern or a comment before that, by all means, jump right in. All right? So we are going to be talking today about immigration, human rights, and borders. So let me start, Jason, with a really simple question. What is a border?
The question was, what is a border? And I think my greatest lesson in that is when I was in the Peace Corps in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was the president in the late 90s, right after I left Duke. And I wrote a book for National Geographic about that time in that country's history that was called Powerlines, 2 Years on South Africa's Borders. And for me at that time, as I said, I was the only white person for 30 miles, but I spoke very good Zulu at the time, at least for me. And I was able to go back and forth in all different kinds of ways and in all different places. And so obviously there's the national borders that we've talked about, but the other borders that existed, for example, in that country were the borders within South Africa between white and black South Africa, then still the borders between the Indian communities, the colored communities, and the black communities in South Africa. And those borders took so many forms that it was almost impossible to detect. Some of them were a kitchen door. Some of those borders.
What about that, a kitchen door?
Well, you know, I mean, here we have those, right? I mean, we have those at Duke University. I mean, and there's so many people who sort of operate on this side of the catering and who go to events or who eat in the Bryan Center or whatever and have no real relationship with the world or the country in which the people who work on the other side of that door work and live. And sometimes it's a language border, as we were talking about earlier. But I think that idea of having sort of a multiplicity of borders within countries and between people, I think that's how I would define it. Anything, those different ways that people are divided from each other.
When you and I spoke before we came here today, Jason and I had a conversation on the phone, and you told me this really interesting story about Powerlines in South Africa when you were there and how those functioned as borders. Talk a bit about that.
So, and this was, you know, years ago now, but in the town where I lived, people carried their water from the river. And they built their houses out of sticks and mud, and it was a community that was very much a third world community, but it was plopped in to South Africa where 2.5 hours away, you could be in Johannesburg and eating at a McDonald's and seeing a movie with THX digital surround sound and, you know, almost indistinguishable from Durham or Atlanta. And in the town where I lived, there was a set of power lines that went right through town from White Town, actually from Swaziland, to a white town called Carolina, and they went across the top of the community, and no one where I lived had electricity, right? So in that context, that border, down at the bottom of those power lines, the literal poles, people were having cows and building their houses, and at the top of those power lines was electricity that belonged to a different country.
It gives you a sense of how borders can be used and access to things like electricity can be used to deprive people. You're on the other side of the line, and so this fundamental thing does not belong to you. Electricity does not belong to you. It belongs to the communities surrounding you. Which brings me to my next super interesting question. What is a human right? How do you define that?
I think that we all have I think a human right is the thing that we believe as a community, whatever that community may be, that each person is entitled to by virtue of the fact that they're a human being. I think that at the Carter Center, we have largely adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the list. We can expand it, we can change it, but that's where we begin our discussions at the Carter Center is this set of things to whom everyone is entitled by virtue of their being a human in any community, anywhere in the world.
What's on that list?
Well, I think that, so number one, it would be, I would say equality. But that list includes, and we would define it very broadly to include a place to live, a right to be free from preventable diseases, which you can also define as a right to have some modicum of health care, the ability to make decisions in your own life that you think will have an impact on your life. That's the idea of personal agency. The idea that you won't be discriminated against because of your gender or because of your race or because of your religion, that freedom of religion. Those types of elements are all come down, I would say, to both freedom, but you have to define that term broadly to include economic ability, the ability to feed and food, shelter, and healthcare.
Do you think we're doing a good job in the United States right now of ensuring that human rights are human rights?
No, I don't. I think that we do a better job than many other places. I think that we do have sets of freedom that matter. And I do think that when that sort of the promise of our country remains to be fulfilled. But I think we've made the right promise, and that promise is as a land. We can define sort of the founding myths of our community in a whole host of ways. We can look at the founding documents as mission statements. I think the way that I articulate the best, I heard this just last night. I was at an event in Washington, D.C. for the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and a woman from North Minneapolis got up and said that she defined the promise of America based on the song Dear Theodosia, where she says, it's in Hamilton, and it says, we will provide you with the nation, we will provide you with these things, and if we do that, you'll blow us all away. And that, to me, is what the promise of America should be, and we have not achieved that.
But you are optimistic that we will. You're optimistic that we're headed in the right direction?
I am, and I live, and after the discussion that we've had, and I think it's important to note that, my family moved to the United States in the 1600s from England. So my family has been, literally Carter men have been white Southern Protestants in this country for like 400 years. And they have grown up in the South. They have, over generations and generations, been at the very top of every aspect of privilege and never have been in any position other than one of relative power. And so it's easy to be optimistic from that perspective. But I believe, having said that, and being someone who identifies as a member of a multiracial community, right? I think of my community as a multiracial community. Now, a multicultural community. What that means, we can talk about that later. But I have faith that that's where we are going. I live, as I said, in Atlanta, which is on some level the capital of Black success in this country, maybe in the world. I have been a part of a multiracial coalition in the Georgia Senate, in my legal career, in my life, in my church, in my aspects of civil society. We are building the kind of community I get to live in the kind of community that I want to live in. And I believe that ultimately that is where we are headed, both globally and in the United States.
Because when you do radio, you don't have real people there in front of you, you just have a microphone. Let me do a quick poll of the room. How many people are optimistic in the way that Jason is about the direction in which this country is going right now? Raise your hand if you're a yes. Are you optimistic about the direction that the country's going in the way that Jason is, that we are moving toward a more representative, multicultural, inclusive?
Well, it just thinks where you think we're headed. Are you optimistic about where we're headed?
You have to be optimistic. A couple hands over here. I saw some optimism
that's basically
over here.
Zero.
Yeah, we did not get a lot of folks in.
Yeah, right.
We have a journalist who's optimistic.
In the middle. So now wait. But let me ask this. Do you mind if I ask?
Go for it.
So let me. Well, yeah. But here's the question. Here's the question that I have. My children are 9 and 12, right? We talk about borders. One other place where borders run, right? Sometimes it's through an elementary school classroom, right? And so you've got children. I have children, again, they're both white boys in Georgia, and they're both the great-grandchildren of a president of the United States. I mean, they're the tether that keeps them above the caste line, to your point, is unbreakable. And so that's who they are, and they're going to grow up in this community. But they also live in a community that is just different than the one I grew up in, right? And you can sit there and you can say, we are having a set of discussions. I went to this university 26 years ago or whatever it was. And no. Nah.
No one do the math.
21 years ago. 21 years ago. But look, the idea that I would have been in this room then it just would not have happened. And we are all in the process. I know that, granted, I live in Atlanta. Again, I'm a lawyer in Atlanta, okay? There's 5 huge companies in Atlanta: UPS, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, Mixson. I'm naming those. No, but listen, the thing about these 4, the general counsel of those 4 companies are all black women. Cox Communications is the other one, which is a huge thing. That's a black woman that is the general counsel of Cox. So that doesn't mean that everything is fine, but it means that things are moving, at least a little bit, right? And I believe, and one of the things that I think has been remarkable that we've watched at the Carter Center from a social change standpoint is, we can talk about, I know you spent a ton of time in Sudan and in Egypt and other places, and we should talk about the Arab Spring and what that means from a democratization standpoint and what it meant for immigrants, et cetera. But the speed with which our communities are changing, the speed with which we're globalizing these issues, right, is just so different than it used to be. And so our social movements, I think, are just speeding up. And we've seen that in a variety of ways. So this moment of retrenchment against multiculturalism, this moment of sort of global disconcerting rhetoric, I just think it kind of comes and goes quicker than it used to. And I think that, as we've all said, that arc still may be long. We know where it's going. I think it gets shorter and starts to bend quicker the way that we interact with each other now. I just do, because I believe that human connection matters, and I believe that we have so many more opportunities for human connection now than we used to have.
I want to bring this back to immigration and to retrenchment, which you just mentioned. I was recently on Morning Edition interviewing a diplomat. This man is in his 90s, and he served in Europe for a very long time, an American diplomat. And it was a big deal that he was able to get up at 5:30 in the morning and be coherent and cogent. And he said something during the interview. We were talking about NATO. We were talking about the NATO alliance and the United States. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, he said, I look at the conditions that we are in today, and I don't see any time in recent history that is so close to where we are now as 1914. And it took me a minute. I said, are you talking about right before World War I? And he said, yes, that's what I'm talking about. And so I want to ask you, you travel the world and you observe elections. And one of the things that you've seen in Europe, in particular, is this backlash against immigration leading to right-wing parties, as talked about earlier, leading to right-wing parties being elected and gaining success. And I wonder when you look at Europe, what are you optimistic about and what are you worried about?
So, the Carter Center has observed more than 100 elections over the last couple decades. And so one thing you realize is that almost without fail, the saddest elections are the ones in the United States, right? Like, people in other countries are amped to vote. They're amped to participate. Now, in the United States, in Georgia right now, we've got an election where the lines are going around the block, okay? So people are excited in certain contexts here. But in places, we don't observe elections in Europe, but when I was just there at the European Union for a conference on election observation. And the issues that they have, the issues that are making them nervous are the exact same issues that we talk about here, right? I mean, it is a truly global moment for fake news. It is a truly global moment for using social media to divide people and to enhance people's own current biases, to sort of support nationalist policies, et cetera. And the fascinating aspect of that, perhaps, and one of the elections that we just observed even more recently, or excuse me, a couple of years ago now, was the election in Myanmar. And in that election, it was a social media, Facebook, Instagram election, the same way that we have. And it was an election not in Europe. There was no Europeans involved in contesting the election at all. And it was seen as a giant step toward democracy. But even there, you had this idea that there was this set of nationalist tendencies to discriminate against religious minorities and they argue racial minorities in the Rohingya. That's just a fascinating statement of how pervasive those types of politics can be, and how pervasive and powerful an organizing force this idea is that we live in a zero-sum political world where I only lose by inviting new people into my community.
Do you think there's an argument that those type of politics, and I'm pushing you a little bit here on your optimism.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Do you think those kind of politics are winning? I mean, look at what ended up happening with the Rohingya in Myanmar. The election may have been a time of excitement and a time of hope and optimism, and yet here we are today, and we have Rohingya actively saying what is being perpetrated against us is a genocide.
Right. By a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Yeah,
I mean, running the government, right? I mean,
it could not be more.
Well, yeah, well, no, I mean, and again, the optimism is not naive. I mean, maybe it is, but I at least am fully aware of this idea. For example, I mean, keep this in mind. The most powerful political force in Myanmar when we were there on the right that was pushing for a national exclusive identity was the fundamentalist Buddhists. So civil society, to your point, goes in both directions, right? We don't sit around in the United States very often and worry about fundamentalist Buddhists being perpetrating, you know, an exclusionary idea of community. But that is exactly what's going on in Myanmar, right? And so we've got this idea, and you can work that into your colonialism theory if you want to. But it is the point is we've got this understanding of how we self-identify. And is it as an exclusive community, or is it as a community that is an open and welcoming community? I just do not believe that. I agree that it is a powerful motivating force. I agree that it is currently successful. It's on an uptick. I also believe that that type of politics is ultimately so brittle that it is easy to crack, because you can crack it with the kind of human connection that I believe is just more and more and more available. Just to give an example, the marriage equality movement in the United States, I believe, was ultimately successful because so many people had personal experience and access to folks in that community, including, by the way, Justice Kennedy and his gay clerks, right? And I just don't think, like, my favorite bumper sticker, you can tell I'm a politician, my favorite bumper sticker says, "Prejudice rarely survives experience." It does. I mean, if you...
I'm gonna counter that too. My God, we agree on almost nothing.
They don't believe it's my favorite bumper sticker? You don't believe that's my favorite bumper sticker? Okay, go ahead.
I was having a conversation with somebody at my office recently, and I'm from a mixed race family. My dad was black, my mom is white. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is very evident in my family is that once people start having the grandchildren, all of a sudden, you kind of you just do see things differently. A white family has a black grandchild, and all of a sudden, oh, the black grandchild is a human. And so the idea is, well, then all black people are human. Now, that was the way I was raised, right? With this sort of idealistic hope that eventually we'd all get there. And then the Justice Kavanaugh hearings happened. And I was talking to a colleague at work about how it was possible for so many men who self-identified as the sons of mothers, the fathers of daughters, to watch what was going on there and not seem to have any sympathy for the woman at the center of it, Christine Blasey Ford making the accusations against Brett Kavanaugh. And I brought up this thing about, once you have a daughter, shouldn't you understand what it's like? And a friend of mine said to me, a colleague, a very smart woman, said, "You're being absolutely naive. It's one thing to recognize an individual as a human being. My black grandchild is a human being, but it is a completely different thing to say every member of the black community is a human being." when you're optimistic about multiculturalism, and I know that comes because I know that optimism stems from seeing people interact with each other. We have a country where a lot of people, it sounds like your kids are in a great school, and yet at the same time, we know this from data. Data tells us that American schools are segregating faster than they were 40 years ago. Let's talk about solutions. What is it we have to do?
Well, I think number one, again, I'm not arguing that it's easy, and I'm not arguing that it's quick. I'm arguing I truly believe that it is inevitable.
You do?
I do.
Yeah.
And so whether it requires a giant amount of pain, whatever it is that we go through to get to a pluralistic, multicultural future, I think we go there. And again, I think the number of people who self-identify as members of a multicultural, multiracial community is growing. And whether it means the same thing to different people, whether we all are getting what we want, whether there's going to be moments of just anguish and division, I do not doubt that that is true. But I do believe that it is inevitable. And I think it's inevitable because if you look at, again, in my lifetime, you know, and I've not told everybody how old I was, but, you know, in my lifetime, we've had X amount of progress. In my grandfather's lifetime, the progress is almost absurd, right? And the agitation and the understanding and the what has gone on in response, I think, to President Trump and to this global sort of right renaissance on the global right and their sort of uptick now, the reaction to that is just incredibly powerful. That's what I think. Now, from a solution standpoint, I think you are probably talking about generational change. And the question is, how are we raising our kids? And that segregation of schools, that idea that is happening is a serious problem. I think that the people who go to the most segregated schools are almost uniformly African American. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I know that in Georgia, you have more schools that are all black than you have schools that are all white. And I think that issue is one that we have to address and we have to deal with, because that, you know, one of the most sort of the way I experienced white supremacy the most directly for me when I lived in South Africa, there were two things that happened. I'm going to tell three quick anecdotes, if you don't mind. Number one of the teachers that I worked with showed me his wedding pictures, and they were in an undeveloped black film canister. And I said, why don't you go get them developed? And he said, that's too expensive for us blacks. And I said, well, how much does it cost? And he said, I don't know. Like, I've never been to ask. Like, his understanding of what it meant to be a black South African was that it was too expensive for him to go get his pictures developed. I know how much it costs. I know how much money he made. He could have afforded it, but he never, that one of those borders was between him and the inside of the photo processing shop. The other thing that happened all the time is that someone's car would break down. Somebody would come to me and say, hey, this car is broken, you know, like, how do we fix it? And I'd be like, y'all, I have literally no idea. Like, Shongwei is a mechanic. Like, I don't have any idea. And they'd be like, yeah, but, you know, white people's cars don't break down, so you have to know something. I almost came to the point where if I had an answer to a question, I thought I was doing a disservice, because people expected so much from me just because I was a white guy from out of town on all kinds of issues that you wouldn't believe. And the last story that I'll tell that it's important to me is I was sitting on the side of the road a year and a half into my time, and I was right on a main highway, and there were all these people that drove by in fancy cars all the time. And I was sitting there with like 3 or 4 of my friends. And this white South African guy in a Mercedes saw me, turned around and came back and said, excuse me, are you okay? And I said, yes, thank you. Like, you know, how are you? And he said, well, are you in trouble? I said, no, I'm I don't think so, you know. And he was like, well, where's your car? I said, I don't have a car. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I live here. And he said, there's nowhere to live here. And I said, I've been here for 1.5 years. And he said, alone? And I said, no, I've been here with all these people. And he just like shook his head and drove off. And like again, like that level of alienation is real. Like keep this in mind. That was the dude, like how many people drove by and didn't stop, right? This is like a good person. He was like, oh man, I mean, all these people were like, man, I bet that dude's in real trouble. And they kept going. You know what I mean? At least this guy, but you know what I mean? But that, the mindset that you don't belong, let me put it to you this way. Diversity and inclusion is maybe a trope. It's hard. Being a part of a multiracial coalition in the Georgia Senate, for example, where we have the biggest legislative black caucus in the world, it's hard. And it requires both white people who are willing to listen and white people who are willing to talk and black people who are willing to listen and black people who are willing to talk. And it's very hard to get that stuff to match. And so the work that has to be done on all sides of this discussion from an education standpoint is difficult. And the lack of ability to do that in segregated schools is a real problem. But we have to seek out other opportunities for the kind of human connection among young people and among others that can model good conversation, that can develop a vocabulary for having these conversations, which right now we don't have. I still am optimistic.
Well, one of the things that I think you're pointing to in your anecdotes about South Africa, and sir, you had a similar experience in Sarajevo, is the necessity of being uncomfortable, right? The necessity of being in the minority, the necessity of being an outsider. I like that your response was, just wave to them both, right? Just make it clear, I'm an outsider here too, and you guys are as well. But we have this thing in common, which is we're all recognizing each other across the footsteps of the assassin. There was an interesting theme that came up earlier. So Jason's a lawyer and I'm a journalist, and I'm not sure if you noticed this at all, but how many people in this room are economists? We have one economist, two economists. Do we have any other economists? How many people are sociologists? Okay, I would love to talk a bit, and this is where if we can get some audience participation, I'd be really interested, because as an economics reporter, the persistent complaint that I get doing deep dive stories in economics is from sociologists who want to know why they were not consulted. Why did we only talk to economists? And when we talk about immigration, there's a very important point here, which is economists are always in favor of immigration, and not for soft reasons like diversity and inclusion, but because societies that welcome immigrants get richer. That's Angela Merkel's it's her whole point, right? We need the Syrians because young Syrian men can do jobs that old Germans can't. We will become richer as a society. There are economists who argue for open borders entirely, not for soft reasons, but because we'd be a richer country if we lowered all barriers. And so I wonder, when you think about multiculturalism and the argument for it, do we need to be a little bit more data-driven in what we're saying? Do we need more hard proof telling people this is good for us?
I think the people who are driven by data are not the people who are against immigration. I think the people who are driven by data are not the people who are against multiculturalism. I think that, like, the decision makers...
But are those two groups of people talking to each other? The economists and the sociologists in this room, to me, hearing you earlier, almost seem to be speaking a different language, or at least coming from a different perspective. And I wonder, do you think that people who are pro-immigration are hearing each other?
I think that, here's what I think about changing policy. There's another border that is almost impermeable, is the one between policymakers who are elected officials and regular people, right? In order to go get elected governor of a state, in order to go get elected to the Congress, you have to do a set of things and spend time with a set of people that isolate you. You spend all your time raising money. You spend all of your time responding to the loudest, most extreme people in your own political party. You run in a partisan primary in a gerrymandered district. You do all of these things that isolate you from regular people. And then the question then becomes, how do we, with data and analysis, et cetera, break through that barrier between policymakers. And I think that the best way to do that, some policymakers make decisions based on data. There is no doubt from an economic standpoint what the value of immigration. There's no doubt from an economic standpoint the value of, frankly, diversity and multiculturalism within an organization, within an economy generally. There's no doubt about that. I think that the way you have to...
I got to jump in.
Sure.
There's no doubt in your mind and in my mind,
Well,
but in many of our fellow citizens'
I agree,
minds.
but that's not based on data.
No.
I'm saying if you're going to take the data, if you're going to use actual facts and evidence, you can't make a data-driven argument against immigration.
But so many of our politicians these days are not interested in facts. They're interested in emotion. And so what do you do with that?
We do agree on that point. Yeah.
Now I need you to provide a solution.
Well, I think that the way that we have to drive that discussion is with something other than data. And I guess that's my point. I think from a political standpoint, I believe that it is sort of an anecdotal discussion. And when we think about and talk about immigration, I think, for example, that the dreamer discussion is one that there's a reason why it's the most powerful and sort of the most likely to succeed from an immigration standpoint. I think that and it's because people can identify with it, right? And I believe that even though there's X number of people who vote, for example, for Donald Trump, or who vote, for example, for other nativist candidates, for lack of a better, if it's going to be a badge of honor, we'll use it. I still believe that many of them do so uncomfortably because of immigration, because they believe that each of these people are created in the image of God, for example, in their religion. Because people believe that ultimately they understand what human beings are. They understand that you don't take a mother's child from her at the border. Those fundamental human emotions, I believe, are universal, and I believe that they are more powerful than whatever it is that is bringing out this division. And I think that's why that argument against multiculturalism is so brittle.
The tough part is that there were people who were in support of the family separation policy.
Sure.
And the question becomes, if minds are to change, how do you make them change?
Well, so when I was in the Georgia State Senate, there was an immigration bill back in the days when Arizona had just passed this immigration law that was this horrible it was in essence a stop and show me your papers law. We went to go pass this. I, of course, was against it and made multiple speeches, et cetera, against it. And the Republicans in the state Senate, we had a system in Georgia where you could vote on amendments. You could either vote on the board where it would record your vote, or you could have a hand vote where the lieutenant governor would just say, all right, there's 32 on this side and 15 on that side, so the amendment passes. And we went to vote. One of my friends, who was a Republican from South Georgia, knew that this law was going to be devastating for the agriculture community economically. Counting up the data and the economics of it, it was going to hurt. There was another group of people who sort of have this libertarian bent and understood that you were turning the state of Georgia into a police state for people who looked illegal. They knew it was wrong. And we put 2 amendments up. And I've never seen anything like it, but there's a balcony in the Georgia Senate, and 25, well, there's only 56 senators, 25 Republican lawmakers moved to the back up under the balcony so nobody sitting in the balcony could see them, and we hand voted these amendments, and we passed the amendments that in essence gutted the immigration bill because they knew it was wrong. And when they're insulated from the politics, there's a group of people who understand that it's wrong. And I think that if we can break it's hard for me not to say bad words. I know this is an economic conference. If we can break the BS political hold that certain very extreme minorities hold over the political parties that we currently have, you will find good people willing to be partners that right now are just cowards because they feel like they have to be for their political lives. That's what I think.
How long have you been, I know you are a Carter, how long have you been working with the Carter Center?
I went to Gaza City for the election and observed the election in Gaza City in 1996. I went to Liberia for 6 weeks for the election in 1997, so 21 years, 22 years.
Do you think that we have been taking steps forward? You've been all over the world. You've overseen elections. You've obviously been an outsider many times. Do you think something changed with the election of President Donald Trump? Do you think that we started moving? Many people will make this argument. I'm a journalist. I can't. But do you think we started moving backwards when President Trump was elected?
I think there's no doubt that we moved backwards. We had, from a democracy standpoint, we are stepping back globally. And that's true, if you look at what happened with the Arab Spring, you look at sort of the sweeping changes in Latin America over the past 20 years, and you're now seeing some retrenchment. You've seen that in the Middle East. You've seen it in certain places in Asia, even in Africa, electing more conservative folks. And then, of course, in Europe, as we've already heard. I think absolutely. But I also think that's coming on the heels of unprecedented democratic expansion. Certainly in
more about that.
Well, certainly if you look in, count the dictatorships in Latin America today and count the number of dictatorships 20 years ago. I mean, you've seen a real transformation of this hemisphere. You've seen the establishment of the European Union as a real factor for not just economics, but political force, and there has been backlash to that. You've seen across sort of swaths of Africa in different places, a real idea that democracy is an answer and a respect for human rights is an answer. Certainly that's true in Asia. At the same time, in our country, we elected, a second generation immigrant, self-identified African American as the president of the United States, and yes, there has been a backlash. And yes, perhaps that backlash, I don't believe that the country that elected Donald Trump is different than the country that elected Barack Obama. It's not. It's the same country. And what we've done is we may have ripped open or had some of the aspects of our country's identity come to the forefront that we'd hidden for a long time. But there aren't more racists now than there were 10 years ago. We are in a place where we're having a different discussion about it. Perhaps people are emboldened by Donald Trump and the leadership that he provides. That's certainly true internationally. But I think that boldness doesn't mean there's more of them. And I think that what we're doing now and what we're on the cusp of, if you look in Georgia, a state where, relatively centrist, heritage-driven white boy from the South, lost by 200,000 votes, you're about to have a black woman who is an unabashed liberal come at least closer, if not win. So how is that not progress, right? And I think some of it was the complacency of sort of the multiculturalists when Barack Obama was president of the United States. We thought it was always going to be that way and that it was irreversible. I mean, that's just 2 years ago. And now everybody's in the room, nobody's optimistic at all anymore, when I think 2 years ago people were like, we've won, and we're declaring victory in a lot of contexts. Now let me say this, the fact that he got elected shows how far we came, and the way that he was treated shows how far we have left to go. But I think those waypoints are real, and the guideposts point us toward the future.
Let me open this up to audience questions. Please. Anybody have anything you want to ask or say, or any drums you want to bang? Go ahead, please.
Hi. Well, I'm very happy you're optimistic. I actually need more white people, especially white people in power, to be optimistic, because I need you to talk to your friends and family members to keep pushing and moving things forward, because oftentimes it's dangerous for people of color to be as optimistic because it puts us in vulnerable positions. So stay optimistic with that. I think also when it comes to a lot of more liberal white multiculturalists kind of saying, okay, we've done it, it's also not really understanding history. And if we were to look at Reconstruction, we had a whole bunch of great progress with Black members in Congress and even a governor. but it was followed by the same backlash that we're having right now. And so I think that that's also part of what needs to happen, is that people need to understand that this is nothing new. And so even though I felt that Barack Obama was very centrist, more centrist than what I was, more conservative rather than what I would like, I still celebrated because I had an idea of what was going to come next. And I was hoping that we wouldn't have to wait another 100 years before we had another person of color who was president, but I knew that it was an option because that was how long, roughly, we had to wait for another black senator. So those are the things that I'm comment, not a question. I always make jokes about people. This is more of a comment than a question, but that's more of my comment. So keep with your optimism and push your friends and family. I've been saying this all week.
About my family, honestly. I mean
your family. Your family's good. Your family's good. Yeah. Tell them to talk to their friends and your friends. But especially in this country, we in white families and some black families, don't talk about politics in family gatherings because we're trying to have fun or trying to keep the safety of this experience. I've been pushing folks to have uncomfortable conversations with their family members. You know who your uncle is, and we know that we avoid him or we don't let the children talk to him. But we need to bring it out and actually have the conversation about why this friend of the family or this uncle or aunt is tolerated, but you don't agree with. Like, these conversations we need to socialize children better. And that's work that I can't do because I'm not at that function.
The only thing I would say to that is there are messengers for all of the messages that we need to carry, right? And there's different messengers for different messages, frankly. When I, there are things that I can do as a white male, and there's things that I can say that will have a very different impact coming from you. And there's things that you can say and do in your community and in other communities and in my community that I can't say and do. And so understanding that we all have roles to play, and again, I just think that that we don't have a good vocabulary and a good way or practice. Most people, certainly most white people, don't have a way of talking about these issues that they can do in a way that feels comfortable for them, et cetera. Maybe you think I'm not comfortable with it either, but I feel like I am. The way we have these conversations, I'm not nervous. And we can do that, but we have to find ways and spaces to do that that build up both sides of the conversation or all sides of the conversation. And I think that we can, but you're right. I mean, there's a country song that's called White Man's World. You should listen to it. You should listen to it.
So.
Question.
He's in charge. I think he
give it to you next because we need the mic. Okay. So.
One, then two.
Should be on. Yeah. Jason, I actually think I heard you espousing what we refer to as the contact hypothesis, which is interaction between people from different social groups improves the relationships between those groups. And then I think I heard Noel say, well, it might improve affective relationships, but it won't necessarily improve cognitive relationships. Or, to put it more plainly, as you said it, folks who have prejudiced beliefs or attitudes can feel affection for individuals from the other group without changing their perception that that group collectively is inferior. Okay, and there's actually some substantive social psychology research right on this point. So that's one of the tensions. I also think that the effectiveness of contact is very much dependent upon the context. So, for example, we can have schools that are desegregated, but they can be resegregated internally through the way in which students are tracked into particular curricula and instruction. And so while a lot of people romanticize desegregating schools, we've now learned that that clearly is not sufficient. And so I think we also have to pay attention to the way in which kids are tracked within schools to really address some of these issues. Another thing that Niraj and I were talking about is actually there's a number of economists who are hostile towards immigration.
You're very right.
Okay.
You're very right.
So, for example, I mean, the key example is George Borjas, who complains that that the quality of our immigrants has declined over time, and we should shut the door. And some people say, since Borjas himself is an immigrant, that he's saying, shut the door behind me. Yeah, So I guess I don't have as felicitous a view of my colleagues in economics, and I typically don't have a very felicitous view of them on most issues. And then the last comment I'd like to make is that I think that we have a tendency, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm the person who wrote an article called "How Barack Obama Failed Black America." But I think we have a tendency to absolve Obama himself of responsibility for what has subsequently occurred. I also want to make the companion point that I think it is taking Black America a little bit longer than post-colonial Africa to recognize that the fact that somebody looks like you is not necessarily somebody who will work for you.
And if you are a white politician in the Democratic Party, let me tell you, you are not allowed to say anything bad about Barack Obama. But maybe this means I'm either not a politician or whatever, but whether or not Barack Obama failed Black America, I will leave to your article. But what the shell of the Democratic Party is real. I mean, in this state, probably more than any other, you look at the number of state legislative districts and all that other stuff. Now, do you want to blame Barack Obama for the backlash against him by people who are exactly who is it, right? I mean, it's a complicated set of affairs. Like, I don't think that it's Barack Obama's fault. Again, the way he was treated shows how far we have to go. Yeah.
I think, had he been willing to not be reelected. Yeah. If he had been willing to not be reelected, to have risked being a single-term president, he could have altered the shape of this society in ways that we haven't imagined.
Well, I know somebody who was a single-term president, and it's not as great as you think it is, number one. But number two, I'll say this. It is incredible how hard it is, even when you're the president of the United States, to make an impact on the government and the way that we operate in our political system. That position is not nearly as powerful.
Fair enough. But as we were saying over lunch, one of the most impressive dimensions of your grandfather's willingness to be a one-term president is he did not take us into war with Iran. Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Well, my question is in comment, very simplistic. Just to ask you, what do you think about lotteries? Because whenever I hear someone say, you know, how segregated schools have become, just poor public schools, and then you said, but then schools that are private are segregated because people have the money to run from the public schools. So that means they're both segregated, right? So, but I just, you know, my two little boys attended a public school that it was a lottery to get in. Therefore, it was nicely mixed. And I think they had a great experience until they went to middle school. You know, but I mean, so that made me like love lotteries. I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I got into that school because it was a lottery. And then I remember their relatives in Senegal, you know, where their dad is from, you know, just talking to them, waiting because their name was in the lottery to see if they'd get a visa to come to the United States. And I know people in that who made the lottery and got in that way. And it's something about, even Gladwell talked about at Harvard, maybe they should bring in the freshman class through a lottery. It may come out even better than it does now, because sometimes when you surround people who you think are down here, they kind of rise to the top once they're able to be exposed. So I was like, she kept asking, so what are you going to do? What should be done? I was like, maybe it should be a lottery. Even I did not win Powerball yesterday.
Columbia, South Carolina.
Really?
Mm-hmm, the woman, I say it was a woman. I don't know why I thought it was a woman. But, somebody won? Yeah, Columbia, South Carolina.
One person?
One person in South Carolina won.
Does anyone want to do a road trip to Columbia, South Carolina?
First, hi. Thanks for this conversation. First, let me say I really appreciate the Carter Center. I've worked with the Carter Center doing election monitoring in a number of countries, Democratic Republic of the Congo and Haiti. And you're right, the turnout in these elections, 80–90% of people was just amazing. It's just kind of inspiring that people are coming out in elections that are deadly. So it isn't just, you can't vote. It is people literally have died in these elections. So I appreciate the Carter Center being on the ground for these. And it's not just the election day. The Carter Center comes and is there like weeks ahead of time, is working with people. So, appreciation for that. A couple of comments.
We're spending even more time now than we used to because elections are really a democracy report card. Right. Who's involved, how empowered are they, et cetera. And you can't judge that just on that day. So we've been spending a lot more time, but we'll have you back. Okay. Now you can say something mean. Come on.
Okay, so a couple points. So one, I think it's really critical that, sorry about it, that it's really critical that, and all of us, that we don't equate substantive and symbolic individual advancement with collective advancement. And I think that's something that, affects all groups, but it certainly has affected the African-American community. And this is pretty much what happened with President Obama, was that the sense that he would move the needle, both from Black community side of it, given a long history of slavery, but in many ways from the white community side of it, this post-racial trope, right? And so remember, it was Black Lives Matter that emerged during the Obama years, right? Because those substantive issues were not going to be resolved by one vote. And I think it's really important, and this kind of goes back to a lot of work that the Carter Center is doing, it really is a democracy question. So voting is kind of one part of that, and it's critical that we tell people to vote. You need to get out, you need to do that, but you have to do more. And that's, to me, why on the one hand, my optimism is there in the long term, but in the short term, I think we have to be realistic with people about the challenges that we're facing, and that countries go forward, but countries can also go backwards. And I think what we've seen here already with the Supreme Court, Kavanaugh's been on like not 2 weeks, and we're already seeing a right-wing turn on the court. And that's gonna go on. We've got to tell people you've got to go beyond the election and fight. Sandy raised the issue of Brazil on Sunday. Brazil is very likely, way more than likely, to elect someone who is, considered much worse than Trump on a range of issues. And there's been a right-wing surge across Brazil, so it isn't just Bolsonaro who's going to be president, but in the National Assembly and other ways, there's been the surge. So for the economists, from my vantage point, I would argue that what is generally referred to as neoliberalism, as a transformation in the way in which economies are thought of, from welfare state politics, Keynesian in that particular language, to what we're witnessing now is driving a lot of the dislocations that people are feeling at the ground level. So we really have to think in those kind of terms as well, that you have to vote, you have to change public policy, but it also has to do with the ideologies of how we think about politics and economics. And we've got all those fights to wage at the same time.
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Of course.
So I think two things I'll note. No doubt that the symbolic advancement is probably bad, right? I mean, people will always cherry pick, you know, oh, this person went to high school in South DeKalb and you know, is a Rhodes Scholar. You know, well, not to mention that she's an African-American woman who's the first person in her family to go to college, et cetera, et cetera. You can always find somebody who's 8 standard deviations from the norm. You know what I mean? The point is, if she was you know, you don't have to be 8 standard deviations like that if you're a white guy. You can be 2. And so there's no doubt we have to do that. In Atlanta, as I said, I was, you know, bragging about it being the capital of black success, which in a lot of ways it is. We talk about how much power, the power structure in Atlanta is African American. It's also the least economically mobile community in the United States. If you are poor in Atlanta, you are more likely to stay poor there than in any other major city in the United States, right? So that says it all right there, right? I mean, we don't like to brag about that from my town. But the other thing that I think I would just throw out there, recognizing that, say, white men have 90 Senate seats in the US Senate or whatever it is. What's the state of white men in America right now? You've got a bunch of poor people out there. And that's who it is that's voting in these ways. I mean, and we don't think about that too, right? They're fat, they're poor, they're isolated, they've got underpaying jobs, they're doing worse than their parents did. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes into these discussions if we're looking at all and trying to be as broad as we can in who these populations are. I'm not playing a violin for white men, as I said at the very beginning, at all. I'm just saying there's a spectrum of how people are doing in this country, and a lot of people are doing pretty bad.
Let's do a quick time check. Where do we stand? We're good?
Hello. So, well, Jason and we chit-chatted a little earlier, and you basically said I'm a pessimist. So I guess this might be a pessimistic turn. And for the sake of us ending the conference, we could probably engage on an optimistic note. But I'm very curious if we're able to collectively pontificate on Jason's story about how that vote had to happen in the Georgia Senate. It seems to me to be a very interesting thing that these people had to vote in secret, essentially.
To do the right thing.
Right. And that also raises the question of how do we construct the right thing, right? I mean, you know, which is under debate apparently. But it also seems to make a very interesting suggestion about how sometimes in the history of particular countries, particular parties are dedicated to a particular kind of politics, which sometimes looks like the supremacy of the white race. I mean, you know, and it seems that there is a way that having that kind of honesty about where the politics is going or is helps us to clarify what we do about addressing the problem. Sometimes particular parties are invested in, you know, politics that could be called the patriarchy, right? There are ways to specify and name that sometimes our more delicate discourses don't allow us to really do. And so I'm curious about what does it take to be able to have that kind of relationship between dialogue and activity that's concretized in removing those kinds of systems of power in power, right? Out of, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just very curious about that. I present a curiosity, a pessimistic curiosity, let's say, you know? Anyway.
So I still believe I think that today, in the mainstream Republican world, it's an insult to be called a racist. The most disturbing thing that I saw today was the quote from Bannon that was put up in that presentation where he said, wear it like a badge of honor. And if we get to a place where it is no longer an insult to call somebody a racist, we're in real trouble again, right? And to your point before, we may, I don't doubt that we could backslide far. But my question, and the question I think you're asking is, what kind of language is going to do the best at making sure that we don't get to the point where being called a racist is no longer an insult? And I think that there's two sides to that, right? I mean, we now are in a debate in Georgia right now about what is voter suppression, okay? You've seen all of the news about 53,000 people who are on a list, a no-match list, et cetera, et cetera. The fact of the matter is those people are going to get to vote on Election Day if they want to. And so and there's Republicans walking around saying, oh, these Democrats, they're just trumping this up. They're making it up to be a big thing, and it's not. We have to, I guess I would answer your question like this. The goal of our discussions, I think, still has to be persuasion. The goal of our discussions cannot be, I'm right, you're wrong, and I don't want you in my community anymore. And except for, we have to draw lines around our conversations. If you're going to come in and say that you are a white supremacist and you believe that we shouldn't listen to X view, I'm willing to say, with respect to my mouth that I apologized for before, forget you. I don't want you a part of my discussion, right? There are certain topics and discussions that are just off limits. But the rest of our political discourse, we have to have enough respect for the people on the other side to believe that eventually we're going to welcome them into our community.
But they're not off limits. They're not off limits because you have public figures like Steve Bannon, who is a public figure, respected in some circles. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, saying, I'm going to come out and call myself a nationalist, with all that implicates. It's not off limits. And I guess that's the thing that's so worrying to me is you can't say, forget you. Right. That's the President of the United States and one of his former close advisors who's now wreaking havoc in Europe.
No, I agree. My point is not that. My point is to yes, call that off limits. But remember that they have supporters who are not that, who still believe it's wrong, who still believe that they want ultimately, again, I believe those people self-identify as members of a multicultural, multiracial community and not one in which they have to be white supremacists.
I think this introduces a whole nother level of complexity, and we'll go right to your question because I have a feeling we're thinking along the same lines, which is what then do you do with that? You have people who are Republican voters who would say, I am not a racist, to which a sane person says, but then how do you support this president? To which that Republican voter says, but I am not a racist. We end up in a feedback loop, and it's a distressing feedback loop for anyone who spends a lifetime interviewing. Let me ask what your let me ask you to pipe in, sir.
Check. So I'll follow up on this point here too. I had a slightly sort of different point to make, which is that, all right, so, what we think of as civilization today, this whole notion of civilization, we might trace that back to the earliest settlements when we first began to grow stuff, right? And this is a moment where we stopped migrating all over the place to find food, and we had food growing in the ground, and what happened with that is we had surplus. And ever since these civilizations, there has been inequality and subjugation, right? And so that's been, depending on how you calculate that, 5, 10,000 years, whatever, right? And so it's hard for me to not take that extended view of history to inform my belief in what's going to happen next, right? So it's difficult for me to get to this non-pessimistic view in the sense that the nature of civilization is to be unequal, is to be unjust. connected to that is what I keep hearing you say, which I think is an interesting point of conversation. I believe, right? And there's this way in which the other side is also believing, right? And I worry if maybe both sides aren't looking at facts enough, right? So for example, we might think that the other side, when they say, I believe that immigrants are bringing in crime, we say, that's ridiculous. Look at the, that doesn't substantiate. But those beliefs are motivating all kinds of governance issues, right? On the other hand, you would say, I believe that if we just came into contact with, if we shared more time with people, that things would get better. But there's just no evidence of that, right? There isn't. Not in any kind of systematic way, right? So the contact hypothesis that Sandy Darity talked about, he's absolutely right in the sense that context matters. That is to say, if two people come into contact from different sides of the border, so to speak, right? And let's say, let's just make it simple, say a white person greets a black person, and they don't have the same resources, they're not part of the same team, they don't have the shared goals, that contact reinscribes difference. It doesn't make difference better, right? So all I'm saying is that how is it that we continue to just push the belief thing, right, in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, whether it's from the left or the right?
So I think that point is very well put. I think that there is no doubt one of the reasons that I'm sort of a Steve Biko black consciousness believer in this context, okay? And so, and that's why I told that story about South Africa that I did. I was reinforcing in my relationships there. If I was there to try to help, we were supposed to be training teachers, okay? And so I was reinforcing. I can't be a messenger for certain things, right? Now, can we construct and are there opportunities to get people together to understand? I think they are, and I think that those opportunities are expanding today compared to where they were X number of years ago. And I think that when you have more opportunities for human interaction, for contact, and more opportunities today than we used to. So, and I think that we can build that and continue to do it. I don't see any other option. Now, you may think that it's a waste of time. I think what you're telling me is there's ways when it works and ways when it doesn't work. And if that's the answer, great. Then let's start doing it the ways that it work. Now, what that means, I think, is we have to be willing to acknowledge the fact that these borders are deep or wide or tall or whatever they are, and that as an immigrant on one side or the other of these different communities, within our culture, without our culture, whatever it is, that we are, that we have to be able to construct opportunities for the kind of effective contact that we need. No doubt. I think that that's true. I think we can do that. And I think that, the real question from the messed up thing, I guess, one of the things about Atlanta, again, and I keep talking about my town, but that's my town, the private schools are more integrated than the public schools, right? I mean, you go to Woodward Academy in Atlanta, I mean, it's incredible. I don't know the numbers because my kids don't go near there, but. Well, but I mean, And that's fair. I think there's something about common experience that's valuable. I think we were laughing earlier back when we agreed on things before this started about sort of the great cultural phenomenon in Atlanta right now is Atlanta United, which is a soccer team, right? And you go to those games and it is far more multicultural than even like the Falcons are the only NFL team in the world where the people in the stadium are 60% African American, right? It's a remarkable place, but the Atlanta United games are multicultural in every way. It's an immigrant community and immigrant support, and it set every attendance record for soccer in the world. 70 more people have watched Atlanta United this year than have watched any NBA team for the whole season in fewer games, et cetera, et cetera. So, and what it has given an opportunity for is the kind of, I think, high quality contact. Now, to your point, are people getting hired? are people from immigrant communities who are interacting with the chief lawyers at law firm A or B getting hired? And is that contact effective, or is it, I don't know. But there is a set of common experience that's available. I don't mean to put down the integration by athletics, but I think that you're still talking oftentimes about high quality contact in those contexts. And so, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I won't dance with you on that too much, but I do appreciate the optimism. I think as a person who's working to be part of the American governance structure, I'm happy to have you optimistic and hopeful. And yet you want to write out folks who hold certain beliefs, right, from conversation. And this is the point here, right? So the issue is that I think in some ways Democrats haven't been talking to these people for a long time, and now we're paying the price for it, right? And so, we've abandoned unions, right? We've gone with Wall Street over unions. And if people state that they have certain beliefs about the world, if we want to characterize those beliefs as racist, we don't hear them out. We don't want to hear the story. And I say that in part just so I don't know if I want to say so I don't have tenure, so I have to be careful.
Dude, I have no control over your tenure.
I know. No, but this thing is recorded for posterity. But one of the things I will say, right, is I work in a sociology department where the guy whose office is next to me has written a paper making an argument for the genetic basis of race, right? I, of course, have a really different... Yes. You shouldn't say that on the mic. Right? And yet, right, what I intentionally do is go to his workshops, read his papers, talk to him about his stuff, right? And I hate to say this, especially in the company of Sandy Darity, who will probably disown me after this in a certain sense, which is I always hold open the potential, right? I haven't seen any genetic evidence for race, but in talking to him, I have to hold open the potential that maybe something that he says, some evidence that he has, some experience he's had or whatever might change my mind, right? And so I go into those conversations with my own set of thinking for sure and with a perspective that I'm trying to share. But in order to make those conversations productive, I also have to be open to what his evidence is, what his perspectives are. And it's only in those kinds of conversations where I think that we can begin to cross these borders, so to speak. So the notion that we won't listen to particular people with particular perspectives or making particular claims, I mean, especially if you're white, I mean, it's not like the person's gonna try to lynch you, so to speak, right? I can understand if you're black, you don't want to get too close, right? But it seems to me like those are precisely the people that Democrats and liberals need to be engaging in a more systematic fashion.
So let me ask you this. If I think that we sometimes let the outcome of elections define our understanding of our community just because they define our government. And there's always going to be people that I disagree with, right? There's always going to be people, and that's healthy. You would want that. If we all agreed, it would be terrible. I mean, this has been super pleasant because we've been able to push back and forth on these things. That's part of who we are and how we all should be in terms of getting towards the truth and everything else. I'm a lawyer, right? We litigate. But there's aspects, there are people who I would invite into a governing coalition. There's people who I would accept into my community, right? This person I don't know, because I don't know enough about it. But there are people who I'm willing to exclude from my community. That's what I'm saying. And if you're going to come in and say, I want to be a part of your community, but only if the white people stay on top, I'm going to say, yeah, well, I mean, I don't consider you a part of the community that I belong to, right? So if I'm going to self-identify that way. And so the reason I say that about who those folks are and about elections, and the reason I started with elections is because we have to remember, right, that to the point we made earlier about who votes, half the people in this country are not registered to vote, who are voting age. Half of those people do vote, so that's 25%. Half of those people don't vote in a partisan primary, so that means that, whatever it is, 1/8 of the people are the ones picking our candidates. And then 1/16 are the ones who are picking the Republican candidate. And then half of those people are a little bit uncomfortable with the Republican candidate, right? I mean, so you've got a tiny slice of our actual community defining who the government is, which then becomes the symbol of our country to the world, and it does all this horrible damage, right? But we can exclude people from political discourse, right? Or say, I think that's illegitimate in the context of my political discourse or my community without, because I think they have no value. I think I'm allowed to do that. That doesn't mean you don't want to be open-minded. And I think that what I have tried to say, or at least we'll say again, is the people that I interacted with in the Georgia Senate, for example, who got elected by the Tea Party, are the kind of people who could sit and have a legitimate, real conversation about these issues right now. And we could find a lot of common ground. And I don't think any of them would consider themselves or would take pride in being called a racist. I don't.
We have limited time, but there's a young lady in the back whose hand has been up for a while. Let me...
Kind of just wanted to build off of that last point. I think so, is it? Yeah. Okay. I hear you saying that persuasion is sort of the basis of politics, and then I heard the professor there saying that that it sounds like what you're talking about is maybe not actually open to persuasion if you're sort of not willing to engage with like this explicit racism. And that sort of reminds me of the Citizen Outsider book, where the Republican ideology in France does not allow for the expression of like a racist society. And I'm wondering, like, is that something we really want to emulate? If the goal is actually persuasion and to sort of convince the other side and whatnot, like, don't we have to sort of go, and I say, like, someone as a white person who's not in danger, like, isn't the goal sort of to, like, go to the talks of the person who's, like, writing these awful papers and talk to them and sort of have this engagement and find a language to sort of articulate these problems? Or is it really just sort of a fear of having like a racist society reflected on you? I guess, I don't know, sorry, that's kind of incoherent, but I guess I'm sort of saying that, like, maybe making this more explicit and actually engaging with it more could allow for the creation of new ways to deal with it, instead of just like blocking it off.
That sounds to me like you're glad that Donald Trump has brought all this stuff before.
No, I wouldn't say that I'm like, a Zizek, like, yeah, let's vote for Trump, but
I think you're making
I agree.
A very interesting point. I think we are still all figuring out how to try to engage with each other in this new world in 2018. We will do that in the midterm elections. A vast minority of us will do that in the 2018 elections. The majority of us will have something to say about how those elections turn out. But I think this young lady in the corner has made an important point, which is the same point you were making earlier. We need a new language for a lot of these things. We need to not shut each other down with words like racist or nationalist or well, yeah, it's fine to shut someone down with a word like racist. There, right? We have to.
We're struggling.
We're struggling here. This is the. I think my ending note is we have figured out nothing here today, but y'all are fascinating, and I'm glad. I'm glad I came. We're still talking.
Liar.
Well, thank you for having us. Any last thought? Okay, thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
That was great. That was perfect.